Yeah, hello everybody. I just want to start off by saying thank you to the RailsConf program committee for giving me the opportunity here to give this talk on this topic. It's one that I find really interesting and really fun to learn about. So without further ado, this is Unpacking the Rails I18n Toolkit. So first up, my name is Chris Fung, as I was so introduced. I've been working with Ruby and Rails for over 10 years, and currently I am a staff engineer at a startup called Binti. And just really quick, just to give a rundown of what Binti is, we are a mission-driven SaaS company that believes every child deserves the care and support of a loving family. Over 550 agencies use Binti in 36 states, serving 46% of children in care nationwide. Over 85,000 families have used Binti to become foster or adoptive parents, and over 12,000 social workers use Binti and benefit from up to 40% time savings every day. So this talk is about localization, but to start off with, what is localization, and why should you care about it? Well, localization means to adapt content from one locale into another. A classic example of this would be, say, you have a Rails app, like an online store or a CMS, where all of the text is written in English. And the process of adapting that text into French or German or Japanese, for example, would be called localization. You might also see localization written as L10N. This is called a numeronym, where the 10 stands for the 10 letters between the L and N of localization. And so in that previous definition, I specifically said localization is not about adapting between languages, but between locales. And a locale is a combination of a language and a region, and potentially also a script. They're often represented as codes, such as EN, FR-CA, or ZH-HANTI-HK. And the important bit here is that a locale doesn't represent just a language, because languages can be spoken by different people all around the world in different situations, different regions, like all over the place. And these regional variations, they affect how the text and the data in your applications need to be represented. And so the last term I want to define before we really get started is internationalization, also called I18n. And so if localization is the process of adapting content from one locale into another, then internationalization is the process of designing software so it can be easily localized. There are a lot of little pitfalls and blind spots that could trip you up when it comes to internationalization. But luckily, Rails provides us with a very good set of tools built right into the framework that are very easy to use and mostly just stay out of your way. So that's all well and good, right? But why should you care? Don't most people speak English, right? Isn't English good enough to get to most people? What benefits do you actually gain from localization? Well, first off, give me a show of hands. Who here speaks English as a second language? OK. How about who knows someone who speaks English as a second language? Yeah, right, that's pretty much everybody, right? So worldwide, there are about 1.5 billion English speakers, but the total world population is actually closer to 8 billion. And that means there's 6.5 billion people out there for whom English is not their first language. And even in the US, according to the US Census, there are 21.7% of residents who speak a language other than English at home. And 8.2% of US residents say they speak English less than very well. And so that's all to say, no, English is not enough. You might default to English, and it's a pretty good place to start. But even in the US, English is not enough if you want to reach the most people, especially people who may have been underserved or excluded from technology due to their language. OK, great. So let's say I've convinced you. You've decided you want to localize. Where do you start? And luckily, again, Rails makes this very easy. With just a small toolkit of built-in utilities and a few gems from the community, Rails lets us easily go from a monolingual app to one that can support however many languages we want, without needing to become an expert in software localization, languages, or linguistics. So in this talk, we're going to look at how you can use these tools to translate your UI text, adapt your UI to different data formatting patterns, and even support different rules for constructing plurals and lists. And at the end, we'll have an app that feels just as natural in any language as it does in English. OK, part one, translate your text. So the first step to translating your text is actually to externalize your text. And there's a lot more to externalizing than what I'm going to be able to cover here. But the basic idea is you need to look for hard-coded text anywhere in your application that it might be shown to a user. And so let's take, for example, this excerpt from a hypothetical view. It's got a h1 tag, says create post, and then there's a paragraph tag that says write your post below. And I hope it's pretty clear that since the text here is in English, the view can only ever render in English, because that's just how it's written. If we wanted to display the text in another language, we can't. And so this brings us to the first of Rails I18n utilities, a little helper called translate. This is available in controllers and views and has a pretty simple signature. First, it takes a key. So this is an identifier like greeting or errors.notfound. And then it takes a bunch of different keyword arguments. And these are used for a lot of different purposes, but mostly for variables, as we'll see later on. So translate's purpose is to let us dynamically render text in a different language at runtime. It uses the first argument, the translation key, to look up what string to return based on the current locale. And if we change the locale, for example, from English to French, then we also change where translate will look up the string. So instead of hello world, we get bonjour le monde. So if we go back to the example from before, we can replace the hard-coded text with calls to translate. And here I'm just using T, which is an alias for brevity. Now the template no longer contains the hard-coded text. Instead, it'll be fetched at runtime from the current locale. But of course, we do still also have to provide the text for translate to display. And Rails does this with YAML files, which are conventionally placed in the config/locales directory. Since we only have English text for now, we'll still place these two strings we extracted from the template into en.yaml, en being the locale code for English. And externalization doesn't just apply to views, however. It applies anywhere a string that might be shown to the user originates. So another big example is in controllers, like flash messages, for example. And so since the translate method is also available here, we can just replace the text with translate, just like we did in the view. OK, so once we've externalized all the text, the next step is we need to choose target locales. And you may already know what locales you want to target. But if you don't, a good place to start is by asking yourself, who do you want to reach with your application? If you're a global product, one way to start is by looking at what regions you want to target. So you can use a site like this one. This is Ethnologue, to research what languages are most spoken in those regions. And this could give you a good idea of which languages would help make your app available to the most people. If your main market is in the US, on the other hand, like it is for us at Binti, you could look at the US Census data instead. If you go to data.census.gov, you can browse all sorts of different tables with data about education, employment, health, and language. Specifically here, I have highlighted the language spoken at home data set, which can give you a pretty good indication of what languages people speak besides English. OK, so once we know which languages we want to target, we have to convert those languages into locale codes. And like I mentioned in the beginning, a locale code is just a standardized identifier to refer to the language. The easiest way to do this is actually just look up the language on Wikipedia. Normally, you'll see the locale code there in the sidebar. But you could also use a tool like the one I have linked here to look up the language and its correct tag. There are also a few different formats for your locale codes that you can follow. But if you're unsure, or if it doesn't really matter to you, I recommend sticking with the IETF language tag format, which uses dashes here. This is the one that Rails uses internally, and it's the one that's used by all the gems that I'm going to mention today. OK, so once we know the locales we want to target, now we can translate the text. And here again, there are two options. On the one hand, you could hire a language services provider, also called an LSP. These are big organizations that provide services like translation, proofreading, QA, et cetera. They also may be able to provide translators who specialize in specific regions or specialize in specific domains. And so they can provide more accurate or culturally appropriate translations for your text. If you're a larger organization, this might be a good option for you to consider. But on the other hand, there's also a DIY route where we can use machine translation instead. And it's a lot easier to get going because all you need is an API key. But of course, the caveat is that while machine translation and AI translation have improved a lot over the years, they're still imperfect and they can still struggle. So it's important that you're able to give the AI as much context as possible about how your text is used so it can generate like a good translation. OK, but let's say we want to go down number 2 and go the DIY route. So how do we do that? And this brings us to the first community gem that I'm going to mention today. It has a somewhat generic sounding name, I18n tasks. But what it really is a CLI with a bunch of different commands that help you manage the locales in your app. So it's just a gem, so all we have to do is add it to the gem file and bundle install. Then we got to choose a translation provider, so like Google Translate, for example. I18n tasks uses environment variables, so we put the API key into the appropriate variable. And then finally, we can run the translate-missing task. This will take the source locale, so English in our example, and then our list of target locales, and translate them using Google Translate. And so once we've done that, if you look in your config locales directory, you'll see a bunch of new YAML files for each of your target languages with the machine-translated text. And congrats, right? Your app is translated. You're all done. Well, no, unfortunately. Fortunately, you're not done. Part 2, advanced localization. And that's because localization is about a lot more than just text. Especially in software today, there's all sorts of data besides text that also needs to be considered when you're trying to provide a localized experience for your users. So I want to start off just talking about dates. A lot of what I'm going to cover here is also applicable to other kinds of data, like numbers or currency. But just to keep it short, I just want to focus on dates for now. So here's another view. We want to add a list showing some metadata about our posts. We specifically want to show when the post was posted. And since we're using Rails, we can the post model has a create@at timestamp. And one way we could display that is by using the strftime function, just to format the timestamp. This would end up showing something like July 10th, 2025. But there's a problem here. Like in the previous example, we can see some hard-coded English text. So let's externalize that. And we also need to include the formatted date, in addition to just the static text. So like I alluded at before, translate lets us pass variables into the translation. So we can pass the formatted date as a variable called date. And then when we define the string in en.yaml, we can include the variable with curly brackets. These variables are really important whenever a translation needs to include some sort of dynamic data, because the word order of a phrase in a different language may differ than your source language, and you may have to move the parts around. For example, like in Japanese, the date would actually come first in this phrase. And so using the variable lets the translators move the parts around into their appropriate place for the language's grammar. So this gets us pretty far, but there's still another problem. So this is a website y'all should be really familiar with at this point. This is how we write a date in American English. But the same date in the UK would be written like this. The day comes first, before the month, if that's unclear. And in Japanese, the format is even more different. So how do we account for this? Well, just like with text, Rails provides us with a helper method to handle data called localize. It takes the object to be localized, which is something like a date, a time, or a number. And then it can also take some options, which are generally used to choose a specific format other than the default format for that data type. So if we go back to the previous example, we can replace strf time with localize instead. And now the date format can change based on the current locale. Just like how translate would use en.yaml to look up translations, localize will use the YAML file to look up the formats. But of course, we have to provide the formats. So let's go back to en.yaml, and we can enter in a default format for dates. There's also a possibility to define other named formats if you want like a long format or a short format or for some other specific purpose. But this leaves us with a question. How do we know what the data format should be for another language? What should we fill in here for Japanese? And so to find this data, we can turn to Unicode. And you may have heard of Unicode and the Unicode Consortium as the ones who are responsible for deciding what emojis make it into your devices every year. But as it turns out, Unicode is about a lot more than just emojis. One of the goals of their project is to enable software to be used by anyone in any language anywhere in the world. And so to further that goal, Unicode hosts the Common Locale Data Repository, or CLDR. CLDR is this huge collection of building blocks for software to support different languages. It includes things like translations of language and country names, rules for how to sort lists in different scripts, preferences for calendars and week systems, and more importantly for this part of this talk, formatting rules for many data types, including numbers, currencies, and dates. So for dates in particular, CLDR provides us with a handful of standard formats for long, medium, and short dates. And here on screen, this is just a small sample of what the long format looks like in the CLDR data. On the right, you have the format string, which is written in CLDR's special formatting DSL. And then on the left, you have the list of locales that the format applies to. So that's all great, but how do we use this data in Rails? And once again, there's a gem for that. There's actually a couple different gems that clean up and re-export the CLDR data, but the one I want to focus on here is this one called Twitter CLDR. I think Twitter is like a social network or something. At its core, what Twitter CLDR does is it uses the CLDR data to format different data types into their localized equivalents. But it also provides a very nice interface into the CLDR directly, which lets us access that data and transform it into a format that works better with Rails. So let's take a quick look at how we might do that. So here's a little script demonstrating how we can use Twitter CLDR's date data reader to programmatically access data from the CLDR. So first we set the locale to English, then we set the date style to long. And then when we make a new data reader object, we can call pattern on it. And then we get the format for the requested locale, which for English in this example is 4Ms D, Y. And then we can repeat that for any other locale, such as Japanese here. And we get the format back. But you might have noticed, and I kind of alluded to this as well, the data formats that we get back from those past two slides are slightly different than the one that we saw at the beginning of this section. And that's because CLDR, it uses its own formatting language when it's specifying these formats. But Rails expects us to use Ruby's strf time language. So that means they're not directly compatible. But converting between them is actually pretty easy, thanks to a map such as this one, which I copied out of the Shopify /worldwide gem. So then, if we combine all that stuff together, we take the map from the previous slide and the formats that we got from the scripts earlier, we can finally generate the date format for Japanese. And then we can use all of that to repeat this process for any other language that we want to target. So with those formats loaded, we can see that localize will pick them up automatically to generate the correct format string in English or in Japanese. So neat. OK, let's talk about plurals. So let's add another list item to our view. We want to show how many comments this post has. We've all probably done the thing where we just stick a parentheses s onto the end of the word if it maybe has to be plural. And maybe you've even done something a little more clever like this, where you conditionally add the s if the count is more than 1. There's a couple problems here. So first off, of course, we have hard-coded text. There's the word comment in this view. But there's also some hard-coded logic, specifically the handling of that plural s. And although English is generally pretty regular when it comes to plurals, there are many examples of words that have no plural, like sheep. Or maybe they have an irregular plural, like mice. So how do we account for this in localization? And once again, though, luckily, Rails has support for plurals as well, baked right in. So we start by externalizing the string as before, but then we also pass this special variable called count, with the value being the number of comments or the number of things that we're counting. And then when we go to the locale file to write the translations, instead of writing the strings directly, we supply these two special subkeys. For one, we write the message as if there was only one item. And then for other, we write the message in the plural case. And these keys are what signal to Rails that this translation, it has pluralization logic. So it's going to look at the count to choose which variant to use. But once again, how do we handle other languages? English is relatively simple, as we just described, but other languages are different. Chinese and Japanese, for example, they generally don't have special plural forms. Languages like Hebrew, for example, have a special form for just 2 items. And other languages like Russian, they have even more categories. So how do we know which categories a language needs, and how we're supposed to choose between them? So once again, we can turn to CLDR. CLDR contains all of this data on the plural categories used by every language it covers. And it also includes the rules for how to choose between which form for a given count. So here on screen, this is the data for Irish, which uses a total of 5 different plural categories. So how do we use this data? How do we get it into Rails? And once again, there's a community gem for that. This one is called Rails I18n. This is another very generic name. But what it is like it's a combination of a bunch of different locale data that is just really easy to plug into your Rails application. One thing it does include is the pluralization rules for many languages coded as Ruby classes that are directly usable by Rails' I18n. So after you install the gem, it will allow Translate to look up the appropriate pluralization algorithm for the current locale. The major caveat here, of course, is that you still need to provide the actual translations for the different categories in all of the languages you want to support. So here's an example of what that might look like. On the left, we have English, like from the previous slides. And then on the right, we have Russian. So we know that Russian, in addition to one and other, it also uses few and many. So when we make the translations, we have to make sure that the Russian includes few and many variants for this specific key, in addition to the one and other. And with that data input into our locale files, when we run the code, we can see that the phrase gets correctly pluralized based on the locale. Neat. OK, finally, let's talk about lists. So let's add a tag list to our post metadata. Post might have many tags, so we're just going to list them all by joining the tags together with a comma. Of course, can't have hard-coded text, so let's externalize and apply translate. But there's one piece of hard-coded text left here. Can anybody spot it? Right, yeah, it's the comma. So different languages may use different punctuation, especially if they use a different script than English. My favorite example of this is Japanese, which uses this very special looking comma on screen here. And no, that is not a space inside the quotes. That is padding that is built directly into the comma character. Additionally, languages may have different rules about how punctuation is used, such as whether a punctuation mark is used to join two items of a list, or whether there is a special connector word that's used instead. This data is actually already loaded inside of Rails I18n, so we don't need to do anything else to bring it in. But how do we put it to work? So going back to our example, we can replace join with toSentence. toSentence is an array extension provided by Rails, but you can also call it as a helper if you don't want to use the monkey patch. It simply joins the items of the array by looking up the appropriate word connectors from the locale YAML. And this is just an example showing toSentence in action. So we can see just by changing the locale, toSentence will look up the correct punctuation marks and connectors to join the array together. So we can see in Japanese here, Japanese actually doesn't use a connector word at the end. It just uses punctuation all throughout. Whereas we can see in English, we get the commas, and then we get a special connector word for the last item. OK, wrapping up. So to recap, so by this point, we've got a pretty robustly internationalized app. We've externalized all of the hard-coded text and all of the data formats. We have machine-translated the locale files, and we can easily update those translations as the source text changes. And we're leveraging data formats, plural rules, list connectors, all from the standard CLDR data. And to get all of this, we only had to use 4 small gems. I18n, which is bundled with Rails by default, and the 3 other gems that I mentioned here, I18n tasks, Twitter CLDR, and Rails I18n. So if you have one takeaway from this talk, I hope it's this. Rails makes internationalization very easy. You don't have to become an expert in software localization, languages, linguistics, or the Unicode standard. All of this knowledge is already collected for you and right there available at your fingertips in this very easy to consume, very easy to use package. So that's it. That's all I have. Thank you, and good luck on your localization journey. These are my links and credits. And yeah, if you want to ask me questions, I'll stick around by the stage. Feel free to come up and talk to me.